So, Bishop Royster, it is great to have you with us. How are you today?
I'm doing good, Reverend M. Good to be here with you today.
It's great to have you. For all of the folks who have been listening to the podcast kind of religiously, they know that there's been a huge gap. That's because there's been some organizational turbulence. Would that be the right word, Bishop Royster?
I think that's fair.
There's been some organizational turbulence, but we now, Faith in Action, has a new executive director. You are our new executive director. So before we get into any content, we'd love to hear a little bit about you. Um,
Sure.
so I just tell us a little bit about yourself, and I have a follow-up question to that.
Okay, cool. So, hi, everybody. I'm Dwayne Royster. I am the new executive director of Faith in Action. I am a guy from Philly. I mean, I think that's the best way to define me. Most people that know me know that I am deeply in love with the city of Philadelphia, the place of my birth and my growing up. Um, I am a clergy person. I've been a pastor for over 32 years and ministering during that time frame in multiple denominations. I started out United Methodist. I was in the Mennonite church. I was ordained a Mennonite. I was in a Baptist church for a season. I was in the United Church of Christ. I belong to a non-denominational fellowship of churches. And now, actually, I'm also a leader of a ecumenical religious order called the Society for Faith and Justice, which is it's a order of Christians who believe that social justice is a spiritual discipline and spiritual practice. And all the people that are part of it are actually engaged in the work of justice every single day. So, yeah, married, couple kids, got a grandkid, doing all those things that folk do out there. But what I care deeply about is the intersection of racial, economic, and climate justice, and making sure that the world that we have will actually be here for future generations, and that we're finding ways every day to empower people to have a control of their own destiny, to have a say in the makeup and the decisions in this country, so that every one of us can flourish and thrive.
Thank you. So it's clear to from that brief introduction is that you embody being multi-faith, given all of your denominational connections that you have. Is that true?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's other stuff too. I was studying Islam while I was in college for a while. I was studying with Jehovah's Witnesses when I was younger. I have been in the gamut of spaces and places. And yeah, and to be honest with you, my earliest church experience when we were kids, this is a quick story. So my parents both loved the Lord and really disliked the church, right? They had issue with the church. They thought it was full of hypocrites. But when we were coming along, my father's mother, my grandmother, paternal grandmother, would say to my parents, "You're not taking my grandbabies to church anywhere." Now, what she meant was, "You're not taking us to a good Baptist church." But my mother decided that she was going to start taking us to church. And so our first church experience for several years was in the Unitarian Universalist Church. Unitarian Universalist Church of the Restoration, which was right on Stanton Avenue in Gorgas Lane in Philadelphia, which is now the Unitarian Universalist Church in Mount Airy, and which is a member of Power Interfaith, the organization I led for several years. And that was where I got my original spiritual grounding in outside of the home, was in that place, which was very diverse, very open, very multi-faith. And I think, in many ways, although I am very much a Christian today, I understand the power and the validity of all faith, and how each of those faiths ultimately leads us back to a place of understanding God better and even
Mm,
understanding ourselves.
love that. Thank you for sharing that. So, um, for those that don't know, I'm going to give a little insight here that you've had multiple roles within Faith in Action. You
Sure.
were executive director of Power, which is our Pennsylvania federation. Then you came on as political director. And then, because of your skill sets, you went back to Power because they needed someone to lead the organization, and you did that. You came on as interim director before being named the executive director. So you know Faith in Action really well. But I think it's probably important to ask this question. It's a question that many of us ask of ourselves, particularly those of us who are Christian. Is like, um, why are you the person to lead the organization? Why were you being prepared for such a moment as this?
Yeah, it's really funny. I mean, it goes back a little bit to my call story. So I was a student at Boston College, which is a great Jesuit institution. My life is filled with religion all the way around. Every time I turn around, I'm someplace it's like sacred space. But I was a student at Boston College. I was a political science major, and my goal ultimately was to become the first Black president of the United States. Um, High ambitions. Failed miserably at it. But the Barack Obama beat me. But while I was a student there, all the students were required to take religion classes. It was a big thing. And so I had an Old Testament class of what we now refer to as the Hebrew Bible. This is back in the late 80s. So, and we had to read the prophet Jeremiah for a class. And I was reading Jeremiah chapter 1. Really kind of broke down crying. And the story gets deeper because at the time I lived in 66 Commonwealth Avenue at Boston College, which had formerly been a convent for nuns. And so literally I was living in a nun cell. That our dorm rooms were cells. They were former nun cells. And I broke down crying. I'm weeping. I get on the phone. I call my mother. I had read Jeremiah 1:4-10, which is the call story of Jeremiah. And in particular, the 10th verse really hits me hard. And God says, I put you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, and to build and to plant. And some of that language sounds really harsh, except you have to understand it's a agricultural text. So it's really talking about creating a new field, a new farm, a new place of growth and plenty for people. And I really got a sense of my call in that moment. That a lot of people are called into ministry, and I think they go for, they want to pastor, they want to preach, they want to teach, they want to do weddings and funerals and communion services. And I love all of those things. But for me, the work of ministry was always about justice and how to create a better world, how to transform the world from where it is to where it could be, not ever being satisfied with the status quo and accepting it as it is, but always pressing towards perfection. John Wesley always talked about, moving towards perfection, the founder of the Methodist Church. And I think in me, there's still this desire to move us from perfection. We should never be satisfied with what we have, but we should really constantly be seeking God and how we move to the next place. And so for me, every day, I'm constantly asking the question, like, we're working on preserving democracy right now, but part of me is like, is it enough? Is it enough so that every person can thrive and flourish? Is it enough when we analyze our economic system? Is it working in the best interest of all people? Is it enough? And so I think in this particular moment, as the world's going through transition, that I'm actually been able to live into this call at 55 that I had when I was 19. And in this particular moment, with Faith in Action, not only now being in 23 states in the United States, but also being in 12 countries outside the U.S., I hear clearly, I put you over kingdoms and over nations to pluck up and to pull down. To pluck up those things that are keeping us from tripping us up and preventing us from being able to live, or choking out the good that's amongst us, to pull down the things that block out the light of God and the light of hope from us, to destroy hatred and evil and manifestations of it that are trying to uproot us and hurt us and overthrow those things that would keep us from getting to one another. And finally, once the ground has been fallowed out, to be able to build and to plant a new world and a new way of being, a new way of seeing each other, a new way of finding our ways to each other, so that we can build the world that works for all of us. So I feel like particularly called in this moment, in this space, to be a part of this great organization. It's got a 50+ year history of doing that kind of work and helping us to grow, thrive, and blossom, and help others to be able to find each other in that way as well.
Thanks, Bishop Royster. That was really beautiful. Just the imagery that you were sharing not only of the call, but then just um, how folks were called and what to do. So let's shift our focus and talk a little bit about what it is that you want to get done as executive director of Faith in Action, knowing that it's not just you, but it's a team of folks who are doing it. We are entering into election year,
Yeah.
and I hear it, but I can't believe some folks will say that people don't start paying attention to the election until now. Um, but beyond the election year, there's so much more to our democracy than just electing a president and a vice president and Congress people, but just Faith in Action. We are a faith-based community organizing shop. Like, what's the role of faith in building a vibrant democracy?
You know, so I mean, there's a couple ways to look at this, and I mean, I know we're going to delve into this a little bit later, but first of all, faith has never been separated, at least from the Abrahamic traditions, right? Faith is deeply tied to um, the government. It's tied to the world, right? It's tied to who we are. And when we go back and read the Hebrew Bible, or we read the Gospels, or we read the Quran, right? We're actually looking at stories that are not just telling us about humanity's relationship to God, but even about how faith has manifested itself in systems and structures and culture and all those things to be able to guide community. And so, part of it for me right now is very much trying to figure out, like, for Faith in Action, one, how do we deepen the ties that we have internally, right? Whether it's national staff or whether it's in the network with federations, how do we see each other as part of the other, right? We live in different states and different countries, right? But how do we find our ways to each other? We're of different faith traditions, praise the Lord. We're Christian, we're Jewish, we're Muslim, we are, and even in Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, there's multiple different traditions of those particular faiths that were a part of us, right? And then you add the Unitarian, Universalist, and you add the Society of Friends, and you add there's some Sikh communities in some of our places, right? And then others that are practicing native religions that come out of their communities. When you bring all those pieces together, and we begin to learn from one another and see each other as the gift that we are. Can we begin that process and understanding that despite our religions, most of the things that we want in life, we all want the same thing. We want a good roof over our head, right? We want to be able to put food on the table for our families. We want to be able to work with dignity. We want our children to be able to have good quality education. We want to be able to have decent health care and be able to afford to have health care. We want to be able to have child care that's going to help us raise our children in a way that helps to teach them good values in life. And also many other things we want to be able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, right? We want the planet to survive. So all those things, become very important. We want to be able to not be judged, as Dr. King would say, by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, right? We don't want to view one gender or another as more important, or we want to be able to see each other in the gift that we are to one another. And so part of what we're trying to do with Faith in Action is really get to the root of how do we address systems, structures, and culture that has been impacting us and preventing us from being able to live our full best lives. How do we work in ways to not only understand each other's cultures, understand the systems and structures that we're dealing with, but then also how are we working every day to make sure that there are people of faith and moral courage that are actually in those places of making decisions that are going to reflect our values and help to bring our values to life in the world. And the reason I think our values are important is that ultimately our values are that everybody does well, not just a few, but everybody does well. So it doesn't make a difference if I make all the money in the world if my community is suffering. It's like, how do we find a way that every family, whether it's a family of one or it's a family of 12, is actually able to do well and survive in our communities. And so we're working on that. And so, but to be able to do that, you got to get people out to vote, right? They got to engage in the ballot. They got to engage in their communities. And so we want them out voting. And so we're talking to people all across the country. We're going to talk to millions of people this year in all across the country about getting out to vote this election season. But then it's not enough just to go vote. Let's just be real. Like once you get political leaders in office, you have to hold them accountable, right? And
Yeah.
accountability is not a bad thing. I think a lot of people sometimes feel like, oh, accountability is a bad thing. No, no, no. They work for you. You hired them. You hired them when you went into the ballot box, or even if you didn't vote for them, they still work for you. They're supposed to be working in your best interest. And so how do we then hold those political leaders accountable to an agenda that the community has and making sure it comes to pass with their votes, with their actions, with the things that they do in the places, whether it's a school board or whether it's a town council or city council, whether it's a county government or a state government, or whether it's the national government. How are we making sure that at every step of the way, the government's values and the community's values are being reflected in the decisions of the government? But the only way they know is if we tell them. And unfortunately, a lot of people, after they vote, they're like, oh, I never talked to my politician. I've never met them in person. And like, no, well, you need to go do that. And we need to go together and we need to tell our story together about our community and what we want. So we want to continue to build power, and we want to build relationship. And we believe power comes out of those relationships. It comes out of the getting to know one another and seeing each other and valuing what the other has, understanding what we want, understanding what other people want, and then putting all those things together to go tell a story about the world that we want to our political leaders and business leaders so that they make it happen for us.
So for you, I think this is embedded in what you're saying. So, but for you, voting is a one step, and then after that, there's an accountability structure in which folks are, even if you didn't vote for the elected official, that there is a relationship and a conversation about what decisions are being made and how are we holding those elected officials to those decisions.
Absolutely. That's 100% right. Like, again, I want to reiterate this again. Voting is a step. It is not the step. It is a step. The next step is building community, engaging political leaders, being in the public square. Sometimes those meetings are with small groups of folk with political leaders. Sometimes it's big meetings and direct action meetings. Sometimes it's going to town council meetings or, state assembly meetings and testifying and telling folk what you want. Sometimes it's knocking on those doors and letting them know what you need. Sometimes it's going to school board. It's all those things. It's not just voting and it's like, oh, we're done. No, it's voting. Now that opens the door to holding these people accountable next. And that's what we need to do because they're our neighbors. They're nothing special. They're just our neighbors.
I love that. They're just our neighbors. Well, so there's a phrase that you have used often since you have come into role first as the interim executive director and now as executive director. You keep saying we need to be architects of a new America, and I think some of what you're suggesting is what you just said. But can you expand on that a little bit? What does it mean to be architects of a new America?
Sure. I was actually just talking to some leaders from other organizing movements the other day, and somebody asked me to unpack this a little bit as well. America, we're getting ready to come up on our 250th anniversary. And America is a grand experiment. It's always been an experiment. But as with any experiment, there are trials and errors. There are mistakes that are made, things that have not always gone the way that they should have. America, I like to say, in its rhetoric was very good. In its action was not. And so when I talk about being architects of a new America, part of it for me is like, how are we operating in a way that actually forces America to live into its values and live into its notion of what it actually is supposed to be, life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. How do we get to that place, right? How do we, get a certain, those inalienable rights that everybody should have? How do we get to that place? And we have not gotten there yet, right? We're still, we're increasingly becoming this deeply multicultural country, but that's still controlled by a minority of folk. Well, there's still a majority at the moment, but it's eventually moving into a minority. There's not sharing of power all the way across the board, whether it's race or gender or faith tradition or economic status. We don't have that. The majority of the members of Congress are millionaires. So how do you relate to somebody that's a minimum wage worker and understand their struggles and their strife? How do we help people get into relationship with one another? And then can we really have a hard look at the way politics is done in this country, right? The infusion of corporate influence in our voting systems and our electoral process, it deeply prevents the voice of the people from being heard over the cacophony of ads that are run by people that are just trying to get you to think their way, but really could care less about you. And so it's like, really, how do we become and it starts at the local level, right? Because all politics is local. It starts deeply at a local level to reimagine what our body politic could look like in the ways that we interact with it, so that eventually, it kind of works its way up. I don't believe in the trickle down. I believe in the rising tide, and like we have to move it from the bottom. And so we really build new structures at our most basic local levels, and then begin to experiment with that and become architects of what a new structure would look like, a new relationship between political leaders and constituents, who are all neighbors, right? We're just neighbors. That's all it really comes down to. And so how do we begin that process of doing that work, and then putting forth an agenda that is definitively about putting people over profits, over corporate interest, putting people over, interests that are trying to divide us and tear us apart, and really being able to find ways to, create new systems that for those that we know are not working. Our criminal justice system is not working well. We know that's wrong. We need to find a new way to do that. I don't know what that looks like entirely, but I think we need to have a conversation with the people and figure out what they want to make it work, right? We know we're having some struggles in the public education system. Okay, let's figure this out. What does it look like? I heard somebody say yesterday, we talk about public education. It goes K through 12. What about from birth until, through college? What about a public education system that goes literally through birth through college, where children are being taken care of, nurtured, developed in partnership with their families? So how do we begin to think about that in ways that we can grow? How do we get to a place where, by the virtue of payment for services rendered, that work has dignity, and that people are actually able to get the benefit that they need to be able to take care of family, and they don't have to work 2, 3, 4 jobs to be able to support themselves. I know so many people that are sometimes working. I refer to it as a job and a side hustle. Everybody got a job and a side hustle because you can't survive if you don't do that. And that burns us out. It keeps us from one another. It keeps us from our families and our children. How do we begin to do all these things? And so that's what I'm talking about when I say architects of a new America. Like, how are we strategically thinking about not only building relationships with our neighbors, building collective power to be able to move an agenda that we want in our communities? Then how are we then thinking about the people that are in those seats that are making the decisions, and making sure that they're in deep relationship with us, carrying out our desires? And then going from there to make sure that we're moving it to every level of government, so that eventually we have a government that reflects the values of the people, and those values being able to live full best lives. And I think that's what we want that for all of us. We want that for all of us.
Yeah, as you were talking, one of the things that strikes me is that we invest so much time, energy, and money into our federal elections. Who's going to be president? Who's going to be our next senator? Who's going to be our next congressperson? And our federal government feels really broken to me these days. They can't even have a conversation with each other, much less, we're passing short-term spending bills just because we know we can't get anything done. And it feels like your notion of neighbors, like we are working with our neighbors to get things done, it is also a call to get really hyper local. Our school boards and our city councils and our county commissions, like that, where they don't have the luxury in those places to say, well, I'm not going to talk to you. Right. I mean, perhaps there are some places like that, but in my school board, we're not worried about partisan politics. We're actually worried about we've at least in the city where I live, we've lost a bunch of people in the city, and how do we keep doors open? And we might have to sell a building in order to get things, in order to continue to provide educational opportunities for all kids. So I really appreciate this idea that we are neighbors working together towards some common goals.
Absolutely. I mean, we're trying, hard to do that. And, I mean, neighbors or fellow pew sitters, I don't know how many congregations people sit in, they don't know the people sitting on the pew next to them.
Right.
And, some folks have sitting there 40 years, they still don't know the people next to them, right? But how do we find ways to each other in that, to be able to collectively imagine a better world, a better community, a better way for us to be together?
Well, let's talk about some threats to
Okay.
this new America that you're talking about. So you just cast a vision. It's a vision you've been casting at Faith in Action for a while. It's a vision that, as a staff member of Faith in Action, like I'm all on board, and our network is really coming on board. But there are threats to that.
Yeah.
Because there is an America that you've referred to it as corporate interests, big money. There's an America in which they're trying to build something different than what you just laid out. In perhaps the most explicit version of this America is with a blueprint called Project 2025. So first, this is something that you're familiar with and you've been talking about. It's a real threat. So just first tell us, what is, in your understanding, what is Project 2025?
Sure. So, it's actually interesting. So just to be clear about a couple of things. So the Project 2025 is actually a paper that was written by the Heritage Foundation, sponsored by the Heritage Foundation and anchored there. And it's basically a blueprint of a plan for the next presidency, if it should happen to be one candidate over another, right? It's designed primarily for a Republican candidate if they should get into office, about the ways that they are essentially going to try to dismantle government so that they can take more control over what's happening both at the local, state, and national levels, to be able to run their sort of corporate / white Christian nationalist agenda. And I say corporate / white Christian nationalists because I actually don't know that all corporate leaders are white Christian nationalists, but they're using white Christian nationalism as a vehicle to be able to get their agenda across so they can get more money. And basically they want to have a major transfer of wealth from us, everyday people, to them, into their pockets. And so Project 2025, actually several of the authors, there's multiple chapters in there. It's about 700 something pages. And maybe it's 900 pages. I forgot exactly what it was.
I think it's 900.
It's
so
900.
You're short 200 pages.
I'm short 200 pages. Yeah.
After 700, you're like, I can't read it.
It's written multiple chapters. Many of the people who have written the chapters were in the former Republican administration. And so, folks like Ben Carson under there and other, key leaders out of the Trump administration that are in there writing this. And basically, it's partly lessons learned from the first time they were in office to figure out, how do we get control of this thing? How do we make it work for us? And it really is a total opposite notion of the vision that I'm laying out. It's really about how to put power and money into the hands of a few to benefit that few and not the many. And so it's deeply disconcerting. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are in there. We can probably get into that are happening. The thing about it is, I just want to say this, is that there are always think tanks that are putting out these things.
Yeah.
But this one was particularly bold because it was online. Anybody could access it. And what that says to me is that we're so confident in who we are and what we're doing that we don't care that what we're doing or what we're thinking. And this is the direction we're going. And so, it's been this very controversial piece of writing. But I think if you were to compare it to at least one of the candidates, you would find that there's a whole lot that lines up in terms of how they're looking at the world. But the way that they look at the world of Project 2025 is absolutely antithetical to everything that we're trying to do by becoming architects of a new America.
Yeah, can you just name some of the aims? I want to talk about the faith component next, but just what are some of the things they're trying to get done with Project 2025?
Sure, I'll be glad to do that. So on page 482, they're trying to end Head Start. and reduce support for preschool and push women to stay at home with their children rather than go to work, which is a very antiquated way of viewing the role of women in the world. And look, if a mom wants to stay home with her children, that's her choice. But to be forced to do that, that's something totally different. They want to end Title I funding for disadvantaged children and push to privatize public education. They want to cut food stamps and school lunches, end their summer programs for poor children, and raising prices for everyone by capping and ultimately ending temporary H-2A visas for agricultural workers. They want to put a national sales tax and a flat tax on all taxpayers. And any flat tax is a regressive tax. And the reason I say that is because people say, oh, it's equal on everybody. But if you make $1 million a year and you have a 2% or 3% sales tax, it's one thing. If you make $35,000 a year and you have a 2 or 3 sales tax, it impacts somebody very differently. So it's a regressive tax. They want to increase unemployment by ending the Federal Reserve's mission of promoting full employment. They want to reduce overtime, so lower wages and working conditions for fast food workers and other people who work for franchises, and reduce employee benefits by capping how much benefits are untaxed. They want to make it harder for people to unionize. They want to end card check as a basis for union. They want to water down rules that protect consumers from surprise medical billing. They want to expose children and adults to more air pollution by weakening rules against toxic chemicals and limiting government's ability to respond to climate change. They want to prosecute prosecutors who make criminal justice decisions and local and state election officials who make voting decisions that conservatives don't agree with. And this is all throughout the whole of the book. I mean, there's more here. I mean, this is just some small, and I hate to say that it's small, but I mean, this is just some of the things that they're really working on trying to do to our communities right now.
Well, and I think what's important in some of the things that you suggested is for you to get really clear about that a lot of this is driven by economics, right? So, for instance, in for Title I, of course, I live in the city, and the public schools that my daughters went to, and then one is still going to, their Title I school. But we have a lot of Title I schools that are in rural areas. So these are affecting folks in rural areas. These are affecting the voters who conservatives at times say they're going after, because there are a lot of rural Title I schools that are in rural settings that they just the people, they are low income folks, and they need help from the government, and so stopping Title I funding or moving funding into kind of a religious based setting, that hurts a lot of folks, not just folks who live in the city, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's actually interesting you say that, because for example, food stamps. The biggest users of food stamps in this country are white women in rural communities. But the story is that it's always Black folk and brown folk that are, taking advantage of these programs, or even the Title I schools. It's like, it's those urban people that are letting all this stuff happen, right? And when they say urban, it doesn't mean urban; it means Black, it means brown, right? That's what they're talking about. The realities, the reality is, in those circumstances, they're using race as a vehicle to be able to get their agenda, but they're actually going to hurt many people that are actually a part of their base.
Yeah.
I mean, even some of our work is like trying to help people. And I know, Reverend M, you know this as well, that we're very much trying to help people understand the manifestations of white Christian nationalism, and actually how it's getting people to work against their own self-interest, right? By trying to manifest this notion of a false sense of whiteness in this country. But we can use race baiting language to talk about, welfare queens, or we can talk about, the kids that are, in urban schools and, no good, and the violence and things of that nature. And people believe that because they don't really know the truth about these things. And Project 2025 leans into that. Like, it is a white Christian nationalist document that is very much trying to paint a picture of a world that is dominated by a certain set of people, particularly white men. And I'm not, let me just, because some people are going to be out there like, you don't like white men. No, It's not all white men. It's just a set of white men. And some of y'all are not those white people. You're just not. Like you don't even qualify. I'm sorry, but you don't even qualify to be in that circle with those folk that are out there. And so, we need to like have a realistic understanding of that, that this is a specific set of folk who have power and money, and they're doing everything they can to keep power and money in their hands. And they will use everything they can for white, middle class, and working class people and poor folk to be a wedge between them and folk of color. And that's really what it comes down to.
Well, and let's pick up one more thread on this because it feels really important given the vision that you laid out. Is so you talk about that it is a particular few white men, but then it's also a Christian vision of this country, right? So that part of what they're trying to do is enact a set of Christian values that everyone has to abide by under Project 2025. So here's another, for instance, as it relates to schools. They want to privatize education or make funding available for private education, but not all. It's not all religious schools. They're not. They would never want us to fund schools that were being run by Muslims, right? Or they would never want us to fund education institutions that were run by Jewish folks. Like this is about private Christian schools. And so just want you to talk a little bit about kind of this Christian vision around Project 2025 and the imposition of religion, a particular form of religion on all of society.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I want to push on this a little bit. I'm not sure that this is really a Christian vision. I'm being very serious when I say that. Fair. I'm not sure it's very Christian. When I read the Beatitudes and when I read the Gospels, this doesn't line up with any of that stuff, right? It's not there. It's not there. I mean, so white Christian nationalism, white supremacy, as we know it, has been manifested in this country for hundreds of years. It actually goes back to Europe, Western Europe in particular, that began the exportation of it, through slavery and the Portuguese and the Dutch and others going in Africa and other countries, colonizing and so forth, right? And this sort of view of Christianity that they had that really put them at the center of, put the European mind, the European male in particular, at the center of faith traditions. And so this is manifested, gets carried over here to the United States. We know that, this is the same religion that committed mass genocide against the indigenous communities that were here and then put, millions of Africans in slavery in this country. So when you trace back your history to those places, that's not good because those things are not Christian, deeply Christian in their orientation. So I challenge the notion of Christian, but I mean, there's C.P. Wagner from Fuller Theological Seminary back in the late 80s wrote this thing called The New Apostolic Churches, a book called The New Apostolic Churches that really talked about what we call dominionism, right? Which is like the seven mountains that they wanted to conquer, right? Which was entertainment, it was medicine, it was media, it was church, it was religion, it was business, and all these areas, right? And the goal was to infuse each of these areas with Christian leaders, but only Christian leaders with a certain viewpoint. Yeah. Those of us that were probably more progressive were not included in that picture anywhere whatsoever. And so, but it's about domination, right? It's about dominion. And it go back to the book of Genesis where, the writers of the King James says, that God gave us dominion. And actually, some of my Jewish colleagues and friends have reminded me that text doesn't talk about dominionism. It actually talks about stewardship. Right. And when you have stewardship, stewardship is very different than dominion. It's a very different piece. And so they have this vision of having dominion in all these various areas of human society, so that they are the ones deciding and orchestrating what the world looks like, instead of allowing the people to kind of figure it out for themselves and to work together and to be neighborly with one another and discover one another. And so it's a very limited worldview. It's a very narrow perspective of faith. Again, I would say Christian nationalism isn't very Christian at all. It's very nationalist with Christian trappings on top of it and Christian language that they're using, but it is not Christian in its orientation. And so we have to constantly challenge that and wrestle with that, because this does not line up with the worldview of billions of Christians around the world.
All right, I stand corrected, Bishop. Thank you. So their notions are not Christian in at least as many of us would define Christian, but it is an imposing of a particular brand of how they see faith and how they want the world to work. So I appreciate you clarifying that. So here's the thing, Bishop. This fight is a fight that has been going on for a long time. This idea of moneyed interests in the values of a few, and as much as I think you and I are contributing to the fight, I think it's going to go on behind us. And so we're kind of at the last question I want to ask about this is, as much as your passion has been demonstrated over the course of this podcast, my closing question really is like, how do you replenish yourself? How do you keep from feeling like this is too much, this is too big? Being architects of a new America is overwhelming. Like, what are you doing to provide ongoing sustenance and rest for yourself so that you can sustain?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things that I think that are important to me that kind of restore my soul. One, I have a 3-year-old grandson, and every time I see him, it is like something washes over me, and it doesn't matter what else is going on in the world, right? And actually, he probably fuels my fight more than anything else. He and my daughters, I think, every day I'm like, I want this world to be better than what it is for them. And so, but when I see him, I get my old body on the floor and start playing with rocks and doing all kinds of stuff like that. So, I find healing in our faith, right? I think our sacred traditions, our rituals, our word, our sacred, sacred documents, I think really help to sustain me and also to remind me that I ain't the only one. And like you said, this has been a battle that's been going on for a long time. In many ways, it feels like the ultimate battle between good and evil. But, I get sustained in that. I love the water. It's actually really funny. So I love water. I love being at the ocean. I love being in lakes. I don't like being in them, but I like being near them. So I love to fish. Fishing is a really big thing for me. I love being able to get out on the water and go fishing. I was mentioning to you before we started the podcast that I actually just recently got my boating certification, and now I'm working on an advanced sailing and seamanship and advanced navigation classes right now. So I'm learning about those things as well. And it's just a reminder, about what people have been doing for thousands of years in this world, right? And getting from one place to the other and seeing each other in some of the most basic and fundamental ways. So, my family is really important to me in doing that. I have a series of devotional books I use every day. I'm big on Howard Thurman. So Thurman's big in my life. So for those that don't know, the late Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, look him up. And he wrote a book called Jesus and the Disinherited that actually transformed me in a deep way. I read it every year. It's stuff like that does that, and then I just take joy in being, I think it's a privilege and a gift to be able to be here in this world, in this time frame. I don't know that every time frame would warrant the same benefits that this one does right now. And yet, even in this time frame, we still see the inequity and the challenges that are in front of us. But I'm thankful to God for this moment to be able to make my life meaningful and to make it relevant in doing this work with great folk like you and all of the staff at Faith in Action and all the folk who work in the networks across the state and across the world, across the states and across the world.
That's really lovely. Thank you for that. So you are you want to drive the boat, you just don't want to be drug in the water behind the boat. Is that
That's
fair to
exactly
say?
right. I am not going to be on jet skis or be on what do they call it? Skiing on top of the water skiing. No, that's not my thing. I have to be the captain. Let's be honest. I have
Fair
to be
enough.
the captain.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
When I want to go in, I want to go in. So
that's awesome. And here's what our listeners don't know, but I'm going to tell them that another way in which you restore yourself is that you celebrate your birthday, which is today.
yes,
So
yes,
happy
yes.
birthday, Bishop. It's,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
just I will let folks know that you said that you have a family trip planned for the weekend, but you're gonna do dinner and then you're gonna also continue your pursuit of your certification today. So that's awesome that you're
No,
living out what you just said.
yeah, during my navigation class. Yes, absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, Bishop, I want to thank you for taking the time to record this podcast. Number one, but then really number two is giving yourself to lead the organization and to lead us both with your vision and your embodiment of what it means to be a faithful person in this democracy. And then I think I'm going to give you the last word, the Howard Thurman quote that I heard you say one of the first times that I met you. What is it that you're trying to do, Bishop?
I'm trying to, well, that's not a Thurman quote, but I tell people I'm trying to change the damn world. Thurman always asked the question, what does your faith have to say to people with their backs up against the wall? And my response to the question is, I'm trying to change the damn world.
Man, a better podcaster would have asked the question and allowed you just to do the quote. But, some of us are just amateurs in this process.
That's all good. It's all good, brother. It's all good.
All right. Well, thank you. It was great to have you on this first episode. For those of you who are listening, we will have another episode up shortly. Thank you so much.